Welcome to our first actual lecture from this time period that we're going through. And glad to see you have your notes. They should look like this. If you don't, go get them. I will wait for you. Okay, welcome back. That was good. It's easy to do when you have this sort of setup. Today we are looking at the Ming and their subsequent following off into the Qing. So we'll start out with the Ming Dynasty. They ruled China from 1368 to 1644. So for about 300 years, and they are most well known probably for their artwork, for the things that people now buy and sell for ridiculous amounts of money. But we're going to look at what effect they had on China itself. So to start out with, we have to talk about something called the Chinese dynastic cycle. So if you picture you have a new ruler, and he is great, and he has just conquered all of his opponents, and he is then very enlightened. So we'll assume, like, okay, James here is our new ruler, and he has brilliant ideas for his people. He will help them out. He will do what needs to be done to make them prosper, and the people love him. And his son comes along, and he is not quite as good, not quite as enlightened. He's more average. And the generations go by, and the generations go by, until finally we get to like EJ over here. Okay, you don't want to know what he's wearing to watch this lecture. But we have EJ over here, and he is just an awful ruler. He's only concerned about himself. The people basically say, you know what? We think you have lost the right to rule. And this right to rule, they called the mandate of heaven. So the people rise up and say, you have lost the right to rule, you have lost the mandate to heaven, and therefore we are going to conquer you, and we're going to replace you with another dynasty. So you have this series of wars, and how are you going to tell which of these two groups actually has the right to rule, has the mandate of heaven? Well, it comes simply down to who wins the war. So when eventually another group defeats the previous dynasty, they come into power. And in general, their first ruler was really wise, really enlightened, knew what they were doing. The people loved him. Years went by. Their kids became more and more corrupt, till finally they were overthrown. Another guy steps and says, excuse me, I have the mandate of heaven. And so they have this battle. And then you get this another one. So it kind of makes this whole cycle where you have a good ruler, and then it goes down, and you have okay rulers, and then you have a bad ruler, and then you have this big battle thing, and then you get another good ruler, and this is what we call the mandate of heaven. So there have been a whole bunch of series of dynasties going along through China. And we are now at the Ming, which is sort of what would be the High Middle Ages, early modern times in Europe. And the Ming, let me make a little room for you here. So the Ming are the one who came in and they chased out the previous dynasty. So the previous dynasty was the Mongol Empire. So according to the theory, the Mongols had the mandate of heaven, and then the Ming come in, they chase them out. The people say, oh, you're great Ming, you now have the mandate of heaven. And so the Ming say, of course we do. And then they go on, and they actually ruled for quite a bit. They're one of the longest Chinese empires. And the things they did upon coming to power, first of all, they said, we're going to get rid of all this Mongol stuff. Mongols are not Chinese. If you ever watch Mulan, they're the bad guys in it. So got rid of Mongol stuff. So that is not Chinese. We don't want it. And then the next thing they do is they say, we are going to bring back traditional Chinese thought. And this is specifically in the form of Confucianism. It was based on the teachings of a guy named Confucius. And the Ming, being Chinese, want to go back to this old thing about Confucius, which you hopefully watched the video about him yesterday. So he lived pretty much, if we do the math, 1,500 years before the Ming. So he was this ancient, legendary figure. And Confucianism has become, by this point, especially today, the predominant philosophy in East Asia. So what is Confucianism? So this is a bit of a parenthesis on your notes, I believe. So Confucianism. If we're going to look at the history of East Asia, we have to know what it is they were thinking about. We have to know what were the basic ideals that drove the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans. Most particularly China and Korea. Japan had other influences from Buddhism and such. But this is the basic philosophy. It's not necessarily a religion. You can be a Christian and have Confucian basic ideas of your social relationships. So, in general, as from the video, we saw that Confucius was actually named Kung Fu Tse. And he was named later Master Kong, which the Europeans changed. Oh, no, that's not Latin enough. It has to be Confucius, because we can't say Master Kong. And so he became Confucius and lived around 500 BC. Actual dates aren't important. Just know that he was a long time ago. And hopefully, we're not going to go over too much of the details of his life. He was a Midland aristocracy. So he was a clerk. He had these great philosophical ideas. He saw all the war that was going on around him and said, you know what, I think we could do better. And so he went to Prince. Prince said, Prince, we could do better. And the prince said, no, I don't want to do better. I want to kill that guy over there. And so the prince basically said, Confucius, go away. Go over, talk to my enemy. Tell my enemy that it's good to be kind to other people. And so then Confucius would go to his enemy and say, oh, Mr. That guy's enemy, you need to be kind to people. And he says, you know what? I don't want to be kind to people. I want to kill them. So you go talk to that guy over there, tell him to be kind to me. Nobody wanted Confucius until after Confucius was dead, which is kind of the way it goes. And so eventually Confucius became this very famous person. His writings were written down. He got disciples. And people said, this is a really good thing. So we're going to look at some of the basic ideas of what Confucius said. Most important is his key relationships. So according to Confucius, you have relationships that fall into one of two categories. you have over here, you have, can you guys see this? Yeah, I think you can. You have the person who is, we'll say the one who's above, and the one who is the subject. This person's responsibility is to care for the people below him. This person's responsibility is to give proper honor and respect and obedience to the person above him. Now, according to Confucius, this will work if this guy always has these people's best interests in mind and only gives them orders and commands and things that are actually good. These people will then naturally want to respect because after all, this guy's a pretty good guy to be serving under. And Confucius says this system can be modeled all across life. At the biggest scale, this is the ruler. The king, the duke, the grand vizier, whatever, and this is his subject, or the people. So we'll make a line here. So the ruler's responsibility is to care for the people. The people's responsibility is to give honor and obedience to the ruler. This also goes to a husband and a wife. So a husband should be interested in caring for the wife, protecting her. The wife then, because her husband is so good, will obviously want to respect and obey him. You have an older brother and a younger brother. So is there anything else I need to say about this one? So you have your older brother and your younger brother, and this one, he has a responsibility to take care. He has a responsibility to be obedient and be subservient. Now, we did have a story one time in the dorms when I was working at HBR. We had a guy who would never do his gratis. And he would, we would say, okay, it's time to do your gratis, and this other kid would come and do it for him. And then we noticed that, like, during study hours, I'm not sure if you guys even do study hours anymore. During study hours, this other guy would come down and make a guy a sandwich and bring it up to his room. It was his roommate. And it got to the point where the one of the roommates was just not doing anything. He was just basically sitting in his room and telling this other guy, oh, go do that for me. Go do this for me. And we kind of said, okay, guys, this can't go on. You have to do your own gratises. And then they both pretty much said, yeah, but he's the older one. I should be doing it for him. And the other guy says, yeah, he should be doing it for me. And we said, well, yes, okay, that might work in a Confucian dorm, but this is a sort of American-Canadian dorm. So, yeah, you'll have to follow some of our rules and do your own gratis. So, but they were just simply following the Confucian way of thinking that because this one guy was like a month and a half older, he was the one who was in this position. However, he was abusing that. He was not caring for the younger one. And the younger one was still saying, okay, I'll still support you even though you're actually not supporting me. Just had a scary moment, thought we lost the entire video. That would be bad. Anyway, so we have these three relationships, and then there's one that is probably the most stereotypical we have here the father and the son. Now, of course, you have to realize that Confucius is talking in a period where he could say things like father, son. You might today, in today's language, say the parent and the child. It's not necessarily just got to be the guys. But the father and the relationship to the offspring. That the parents' ultimate responsibility is to watch out for and take care of their kids. And then the kids, they need to then, as they grow up, they will give honor, give obedience, give respect to the parents. And this will include the fact that when the parents are old, and now it's the parents' turn to be in diapers, the kids will be the one who take care of them, just like the parents did to the kids when they were little. So this is something that is often called, we use the Latinish term, filial piety. So filial piety is the idea, filial comes from Latin for son, piety means the idea of paying respect and in some extent even to the idea of worship. So this is where a child, the son, is very much giving full honor and they put their parents' needs even before themselves. And we will look at this a little more when we come to our part on Korea. There's a famous story about Sim Chung, and we'll talk about her filial piety, even though she was a daughter, to her father, and according to the Confucius traditions, how that like saved the entire kingdom and kept people out of ditches and stuff like that. So let me erase this here. So this is Confucianism. This is what the Ming wanted to bring back. The Mongols were not a Confucian society. They didn't see Confucianism as anything that they really needed to follow. They were more from Central Asia, from the tribe, the loyalty to the tribe kind of mentality. And so the Ming come in and they bring back these Confucian ideas. They get rid of the Mongol things. And now we're going to bring you to one of the more famous people in the Ming Dynasty era. So first, actually, you don't need to know their names, Zhonghu and all these people that your book talked about, but the first founder of the Ming Dynasty, the guy who finally gathered everything together, set up this Ming Dynasty, his son comes along, and he is very interested in the outside world. He's interested in the outside world. What's out there? What are the cool things that we can see? What is beyond China? There are some interesting things that we get hints of, that we've heard about, that we're curious. So we should go out and find out. And the name of his most important explorer was a guy by the name of Zheng He. All right, got to spell it correctly. So you pronounce that Zheng He, and he was a sea admiral, and you don't think of China necessarily as being a big seafaring country like Portugal or England, because after Zheng He, they kind of said, nope, we're not doing this anymore. But this was China's big moment, and they had some pretty amazing advanced technology. I have a video that we'll show you a little clip of later that kind of shows you an idea of what the Europeans were doing and what the Chinese were doing. So in general, Zheng He made 7 voyages. So I've got to keep this all in line with what dots you have. So it's right over here. And he basically traveled from China around, down from China. He would go sort of south and in through all the islands down here and over into India. We know he made it there. He went up into Arabia. He went down into Africa. And there are some people who say he actually made it around and possibly went to Brazil, or others who say he went down here and hobnobbed with the people in Australia. But we don't see proof of that. But we do have proof that he went to India and to, what do you call those people? To Arabia and to Africa. All right, so he goes, he makes all these wonderful voyages, he brings back all sorts of information, brings back ideas about people who have also relatively high civilizations, which is a bit of a trouble for the Chinese, because they have this sort of idea that we are the very best, of course. And it is eventually ruled that his trips do not show proper respect to China. So they conflict with the Confucian ideals. And you say, well, how is that possible? Well, what really happens is that the advisors to the emperor looked at it as the fact that if we look at these two relationships, at the most extreme, we have China itself. And China's role is to provide for its subjects and to give everything that the subjects need. The subjects then will be saying, oh, China, we will give you honor and we will give you loyalty. And if someone is going out and they go to India and they discover curry, okay, it didn't actually come out here because Columbus hadn't visited North America, but let's say he goes and discovers curry and he brings it back and says, guys, this is good. They say, you're not showing respect to China because China should be providing us with everything we need. Therefore, if we are going to show China proper respect, we shouldn't be looking for other things outside of China. We should be content with what great Papa China gives us. And in this interpretation of Confucianism, exploration was an act of disrespect to the country. And so eventually the advisors basically convinced the emperor and said, you know what, this is not a good thing to do because after all, maybe you'll lose the mandate of heaven if you continue this. And the emperor says, whoa, got to keep that mandate of heaven. And so Zheng He is shut down and China basically looks in on itself and they actually then get passed by all the rest of the world, expands and does greater things than they do. So during this time, the Chinese begin to have their first regular contacts with the Europeans. Marco Polo visited in the 1300s, okay, early on, but the Europeans now are beginning to go all over the world, and especially they like Chinese stuff. And they would get their Chinese stuff basically, first of all, through the Arab middlemen over here, and then they realized, oh, if we go a little bit further, we could go to Indonesia and India, and then they started trying to come across from this direction, realized that's a little too far. There's all this big continent that's in the way somewhere. But the Europeans loved Chinese stuff. Tea, silk, things that they couldn't get at home, and they wanted to buy them. And so you began to have European contact. So, yep, so this is on the next page of your notes. And so this is the rise of trade. And so trade is now becoming more important, especially in the West. You have places like the Netherlands, which is really has very few natural resources except herring. And they, because of trade, are able to make this huge, wealthy, at one point they were the wealthiest country in Europe, empire that is just pulling in the money. And so the Europeans are very interested in trade. China, not so much. And so you have these merchants. These are people who buy and sell things. And Confucianism does not look very kindly on merchants. After all, these are people who are taking things from someone else, stuff they didn't make, and they are selling it to yet another person. And this was sort of unclean. This is a little dirty. Is something that, an honest person goes out and plows a field and works and makes a good living. Or an honest person sits there and writes lots of little books and takes copious notes on what the government is doing. Those are good, honorable activities. This taking stuff that someone else made and then selling it to someone else, and you're not actually involved in any of the production, that they kind of looked at that as like someone who runs on the same level as a person who is in charge of a bunch of prostitutes. It's just a really icky kind of activity. And so you have all of these Europeans coming in, and they are merchants. And the Chinese are like, ooh, we don't really want to necessarily deal with your type. And the Europeans, to a European, these are the wealthy people. And you go back home to England, and they're like, oh yeah, so-and-so, he's got money. We will be happy to do things with you. Okay, not that sort of treatment in China. So the Chinese have this view of merchants that is not something to be encouraged. The U.S. does not go and give tax breaks to drug dealers because they say, yeah, drug dealing is a really honest profession. We want to make sure there's a lot of drug dealers out there. That's kind of how China dealt with the merchants. So no, this is not something we want to, so we are going to put really high taxes on merchants. And on parallel, they said we're going to have really low taxes on farmers. So between that, if you have little Johnny over here and said, Johnny, what do you want to be grow up? And he looks at it and says, oh, wow, I would really love to be a merchant, but then I'll have to pay lots of high taxes, so I guess I'll go into farming. It's kind of like, what they would do today. Hopefully, you don't have many grade schoolers saying, yeah, when I grow up, I want to be a drug dealer, because, that could get you into more trouble than just high taxes. And so China's doing what they can to discourage people from doing this. It's just a nasty thing. Let the Europeans handle it, and we'll keep them out. So we have here then another issue that you began to have, and where is that on your dot here? Over here, your last dot under the Ming. You began to have Catholic missionaries. So I don't know if you remember this from last year, but the Pope basically took the globe and he split in half and said, Spain, you get this, Portugal, you get this. And so China ended up in the Portuguese part. And so they said, okay, yeah, we'll send our people over there. And they sent a lot of missionaries. And they were actually reasonably successful, albeit with some of the lower level, not the higher ups so much. But there was a significant portion of the people who were like, yeah, this is kind of cool. And with that, the Ming lost their mandate of heaven. Alas. For some reason, heaven said, nope, no more of Ming. We now have another group, which we call the Qing. And they ruled from 1644 to 1912. And the Qing were actually not Chinese, even though the name kind of sounds Chinese. They were actual Manchu people. Okay, so these were invaders from Manchuria. So the Manchurians are people, well, we'll draw you a map. There's China, Korea, Japan. And Manchuria is this area here north of Korea. So it's not ethnically Chinese. So this is China itself. Here's like Taiwan, etc., Indonesia, all these different things down here. And the people from Manchuria looked at China and said, you know what? They're pretty wealthy. Let's conquer them. And so they did. And so according to the whole dynastic cycle idea, that means that the mandate of heaven was lost by the Ming, and the Manchu came in and said, oh, but we have to, since we're not part of the dynastic cycle, we have to choose a Chinese name. And so they chose the name Qing as their dynastic name. And they actually lasted, they were the last dynasty of China. Unless you count the communists. So they came in and they made, oops, we got to erase that. They made the Chinese submit. They said, we are Manchu. You are not. You will submit to us. And they made them submit, but they knew if they were like too extreme, then they would lose the mandate of heaven. In other words, the people come and kill them. So they kept a lot of Chinese stuff. Okay, so the Ming got rid of the Mongol stuff. The Qing come in and they keep the Ming stuff because that just helps make it easier to rule. And so the Qing come in and they have now, we're looking at the year 1600, there's a lot of Europeans floating around out there. And so they have, what are their relations with the Europeans? So what did they do with all these Europeans who were just knocking on their door, wanting to buy tea and silk? And so we can sort of break it down into a few things. First of all, China had a lot of stuff that the Europeans wanted. Things you couldn't get in Europe, things like silk and tea. And there's this stuff, if you take like dirt and you mash it together and cook it, but it's really, really nice dirt and you can eat off of it. What do we call that today? Where you say, oh, we're having our rich aunt and uncle over. We want to make a nice dinner for them. would you please get out the baked dirt? No, you say, would you get out the china? And so China had the very best porcelain in the world, the very best ceramics. The British and the Dutch could make a decent cup, but not like what China could. And so these are things the Europeans wanted. They said, we would love to have this stuff. However, China also had a lot of stuff the Chinese wanted, and they really didn't care about the European stuff. In fact, they called themselves the Middle Kingdom. And the reason they called themselves that was because they basically figured, you have this wide world, and we know that there are other people out there. We know there's people that are not as good as us because they're not Chinese. But we are obviously the center of the known universe. We are in the middle. We are the kingdom that all others wish to be. And so this middle kingdom really didn't want anything that anyone else would have. After all, China takes care of us according to Confucius' system, and we give honor to China. Yeah, sure, those English have stuff like mushroom pie and fish and chips, but we have no need. Why would we ever eat that? You take peas and you squish them all together, and then you eat it? Yeah, you can just keep that. So there's nothing that they want. Except okay, well, if you put it that way, say the Chinese, there is something that Europe has that we wouldn't mind. It's called money. So they will take their money. If you give us silver, we will give you silken tea. And this causes some economic difficulties, obviously, because the British can't grow silver. They can grow wool, they can take fish out of the ocean, but there's nothing that China wants that Britain can make for cheap. They only want the money. And the people in Europe want this Chinese stuff so much that they're actually willing to give them straight out money. Just buy stuff. It's not trading anymore. Europe is just going to the store and buying Chinese things from them. And of course, China is getting wealthy. So, I have to explain a little thing called mercantilism. So this was the economic philosophy of the day, and this lasted all through 16, 17, even into the 1800s. The idea was that you are wealthy as a country if your country had lots of gold. So you have your castle, and you have the castle's basement, and however much gold is in that castle's basement is how much your country is worth. Today, we don't measure it that way. Today, we measure a country's wealth on something called the gross domestic product or gross national product, how much stuff you make. So if your country can make lots of toasters and sell them to people, and the people have enough money to buy lots of toasters, then we say you're a wealthy country. In fact, most of the most wealthy countries in the world actually owe everybody else a lot of money. So we do not follow mercantilism anymore. But back then, the idea of if we want to make the Netherlands a wealthy country, we simply have to have a lot of gold in some basement vault in Amsterdam, or Rotterdam, or both. And this is what all the Europeans were working on. This is why, for example, Europeans needed colonies during this period. Because in order for mercantilism to work, you had to have someone to give you money. And the Chinese were totally ruining this mercantilist idea. According to Europe, we give stuff and we get money. Chinese said, no, we're not going to do that. You give us money, we'll give you stuff. And so this really hurt this idea. The Europeans were like, no, we don't want to give you money, but we do want your stuff. And so they took different tax for it. The Dutch, who have always been a little more open, and they're more willing to say, okay, whatever, they went to China, and they were willing to do what the Chinese needed them to do. China says, oh, Holland. Tell you what, if you want to trade with us, you have to make yourself look really silly. And the Dutch were like, okay, we'll do it. And they had this thing where if you wanted to pay honor and respect to the local dignitaries, you had to go on your hands and knees and hit your head on the floor a bunch of times. And this is called kowtow because it totally made you look ridiculous. And so that was like, yes, you are showing us that you are not much more than a little worm in the dust. All right, worm, get up, we'll trade with you. And so the Dutch were like, what does it matter to us? No one back home is ever going to see me do this, so sure, we'll do that if you let us trade with us. And so the Dutch were able to trade. Of course, the Chinese had a lot of restrictions. They said, you can only trade in this area, you can only stay in your compound and we will bring the stuff to you. They said you can only trade on certain days, you can only do this, okay, but the Dutch were like, hey, whatever, we will be so glad because we could take the things that the Dutch were able to take the things they got from China, bring them back to the Netherlands and sell them for ridiculously more than what they paid for them. Because obviously you cannot grow tea in the Netherlands. You cannot grow China in the Netherlands, although the Dutch did get pretty good at copying it. And so the Dutch were willing to do this, and the English come along and say, ooh, Dutch people, yeah, we could do that too. And so the English came along, and the guy goes, oh, more Europeans. Very well. Okay, you must get on your hands and knees, whack your head on the floor a few times, and then maybe we'll talk. And the British were like, oh, sir, never. And so, British guy kind of kneeled a little bit. And the Chinese guy was just like, talk to the hand, the face isn't doing anything. And the English didn't get anywhere. And so the Dutch then got this monopoly, and the English were left out. So that is where we leave the Qing. They are hovering actually on the brink of collapse. If we were continuing on, we would talk about how later the English were simply to come in and say, nope, you know what? We want to trade with you. So since you're not willing to take our goods, we're going to go to war. Yeah, that was not a good thing. So tomorrow, or whenever we meet again, we will then talk about what Korea was doing during this time and what Korea did after the Qing came in, and now Korea's again also conquered by non-Chinese people. Chinese? Yeah, they're okay. Manchus? Maybe not so much. But we'll leave you on that until probably Monday.